Okay, chapter 2 then moves on from the introduction to business and now thinks about how a business is going to be managed. So we're going to go through um, a few key areas here, thinking about what do we mean by management, what types of quality does a management have, what are the components of management, and we'll think about a few different models as we work our way through. So chapter 2 is actually very in depth in terms of what is management, and we'll certainly see a few key areas that are likely to pop up on your exam then. Okay, section 1, we start off with our diagram here. So we're talking about the definition of management. So according to Stewart, management is all about getting things done through other people. And I guess when you think about it, that's actually a pretty good definition. Think about how your manager behaves at work. Think about what they're trying to do. They're trying to get you guys to achieve your targets, and that will hopefully then lead through to them achieving their targets and the business achieving its overall objectives too. The diagram just goes through and shows us the separation between the people who own the business and the people who run the business, and it's very important for us to consider this separation. And in fact, we'll think about this a bit more later on in the course in more detail when we're considering this idea of what we call the agency agreement. But again, we'll come to that, so don't worry too much. So managers are all responsible for running the business. We're going to obviously have some objectives set, so we've had to think about that in the previous chapter, and we know that those objectives have to be in line with my shareholder interests. We're then going to see this kind of planning and control system coming in. So we're thinking about monitoring our performance and then thinking about making corrections. So section 2 is just going to break down what the components of management are. So thinking about what the requirements, what the components of effective management are, and we're just going to discuss power, authority, responsibility, accountability, and delegation. So we'll have a look at those in a bit more detail. So we start off with power. Now we need to consider, that these things are pretty distinct. So we need to identify exactly what we mean by power. And power is very simply the ability to get things done. So can I get things done? It doesn't consider whether I should be getting things done. It's talking about whether I can. And French and Raven split power into 6 types. So have a think about your office, or a think about even your family at home. You'll find that certain people within the office or within the business have power, and there will be different reasons for that. It's not just as simple as saying that person is above me in the organizational structure. However, that is one of them, so we may as well start there. So this would be an example of legitimate power, or position power, we might call that. So the fact that you're associated with a particular position in the organization gives you power over somebody. So for example, a manager will have authority, will have the ability to authorize certain expenses. So you go out and perhaps you're out on an audit and you have to claim for lunch or something like that, and you bring your receipts back and they're signed off by your manager, and that manager is able to do that. They have the power to do that because they've been given that position. Let's work through the rest of these from the top then. So coercive power. So you might have power over somebody because you're able to threaten them with some sort of physical force or with punishment. Now obviously not necessarily the nicest form of power, but power nonetheless. Reward power is am I able to reward you? So for example, your line manager may have power over you because they control whether or not you get a bonus this period. Expert power then will be because you have some sort of expertise in an area. So for example, the accountants may have expert power because of their knowledge of the tax system. So they might not be high up the organizational structure, but because they know this area better than anybody else, they're going to take the lead on that. You might have referent power or personal power, and I'm sure everybody knows somebody around work that could have this, the person who can convince you to do something or influence you to do something based purely on the fact that they're a nice guy, charismatic, they're able to talk you into doing things. Finally then we've got negative power, which is added in by Handy, And for example, this would be industrial action. So tube drivers have negative power in the sense that they're able to disrupt tube services pretty easily. Now you might find that people that you consider at work would have a few of these. So your line manager, for example, is likely to have legitimate power, likely to have reward power, may very well have expert power, may very well have referent power as well. Over the page, we've just got a bit of an interactive question here. So again, if you can just pause this, have a think about it, and then press play and we'll go through. So just to kind of lead you into it, we're talking about an IT manager. So Nisar Iqbal has a degree in ICT, so he's the manager, he has a degree in ICT. 14 people reporting to him. What types of power can Nisar exert as a manager in order to make sure a project is completed on time? So have a think through those 6 types or 6 sources of power, and see if you think Nisar may have some of those. So just pause that and we'll come back and look through it together. Okay, so let's think about Nisar. Well, first of all, it does state that Nisar is a manager and that he manages 14 staff, so presumably then he has position power as their manager. So I'd certainly expect him to have position power or legitimate power there. I'd also expect, because he's the manager, most likely he's going to have some sort of resource power. So he's likely to be able to control whether or not those guys get a bonus or a pay rise or whatever we're talking about. Also, the fact that he's got a degree most likely means that he has some sort of expert power. So the fact that he knows what he's talking about. It's always the case that if you're told to do something by someone you consider to know what they're talking about, they do have a bit more power over you. No real information about anything else. I can't necessarily say that he has coercive power, or we don't know how charismatic he is. We don't know whether he can have negative power. So based on the information we have, I think probably just those 3. Okay, so that's power. We'll move on to 2.3 then, looking at authority. So if power was the ability to get things done, authority then is the right to do something. So it's either the right to do something or more likely in the management role, the right to ask somebody else to do it. So it's another word really for position or legitimate power. So your line manager will have authority to ask you to do something. Now, the ways in which you might see authority in terms of management, certainly making decisions. Now, just to caveat that with scope of authority given to their position. So you wouldn't expect your finance manager, for example, to be going out and making decisions on hiring new production staff or something like that. And also probably more likely, the easier one to think about would be assigning tasks to subordinates. So seeing authority by the amount of things that your manager may ask your team to do. 2.4 then is looking at responsibility and accountability, and again a couple of definitions there. So responsibility is the obligation a person has to fulfill a task, and accountability is really about whether you can be called to account for having not done it, for example. So if you haven't done it, can you be called to account for that? Are you accountable to that role or to that task? And in fact, these 2 are very linked. So you'd be accountable to a superior for a piece of work for which one is responsible. So they're 2 sides of the same coin, really. 2.5 then is delegation, and delegation is all about giving away some of that responsibility, giving away some of that authority for a task, but at the same time maintaining responsibility. So you maintain that overall responsibility for the task, but you can give out a bit of that authority, a bit of that responsibility to your subordinate. And in fact, we'll come back to delegation a bit later in the chapter. But just to finish off this recording, over the page, we've got another interactive question. This time we're thinking about delegation, so not really a right or wrong answer here, but just to consider examples of delegation that you might have seen at work. Just have a quick think then about the benefits and the drawbacks, and think about whether or not you feel that too much or too little responsibility was actually delegated. Okay, so just pause there and have a think, and then when you're ready, just press play and we'll have a quick chat before we finish up for this recording. Okay, good. Hopefully you've got a few relevant work examples there. I suppose the whole idea of this is just to think about, well, there are good parts of being delegated work. The fact that you will enrich your working day, give you a bit more to do, give you an insight into a few different areas, but also drawback. Are you being given things that you just feel your boss doesn't want to do? Are you always being delegated the less interesting tasks, which obviously cause the problem? You don't really want to be in a role where you're given everything to do, where you're basically just doing your manager's job, but at the same time, the idea that you're given responsibility is a nice one. It's nice to think that you're thought of highly to do a task. That's the end of this recording. Then next up we'll have section 3, where we'll start talking about different types of manager that you might experience.